Welcome to Beg to Differ, the Bulwark's weekly roundtable discussion featuring civil conversation across the political spectrum, from center left to center right. I'm Mona Charan of the Ethics and Public Policy Center, and I'm joined by our regulars, Bill Galston of the Brookings Institution and the Wall Street Journal, Linda Chavez of the Niskanen Center, and Damon Linker of The Week. Our special guest this week is Eric Edelman, who is counselor at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments and has also served as Undersecretary of Defense and ambassador to Finland and Turkey. Welcome, one and all. Eric, I'm so glad you could join us today because you're the perfect guest to discuss a number of the matters that are going to come before us, but especially on foreign policy and what's happening at DOD and the dangers of this transition period. But before we get to all those questions, let's begin with the president's unwillingness to acknowledge reality. He has failed to concede. He has not permitted the director of the General Services Administration to begin the formal transition process. He is not letting Joe Biden see the greetings that have been piling up in the State Department from international leaders, congratulating him, and so on and so forth. Damon, you had some harsh words for the party and for the president. Why don't you share some of those thoughts now?
Sure. I figured in the end, people have been doing too much of calling Trump a fascist and Hitler, so I decided I would just call him Satan. I decided to up the things a little bit. No, it's really, I guess you could say darkly a little fun with trying to put in context what Trump is doing. And I've just been so utterly appalled, and I'm also on a kind of psychological rebound from being very happy over the weekend that it turned out Joe Biden won, and I was very happy with his speech on Saturday night, and then the fact that we are kind of, as a country, we are like strapped to this guy who is like trying to drag the country into his own kind of psychosis of inability to accept the fact that he lost the election. And so I let it rip in this column where I said, I don't really believe this in a literal sense, but I do believe it seriously that Trump's motives here are somewhat like demonic. He is trying to, or at least is utterly willing to try to wreck American democracy in order to placate his very fragile ego. And I'm not very happy about it. And I let him and everybody else know about it in this column. I mean, I make a number of serious points along the way, and maybe some others will come up in the discussion. But one thing I'll note here, I noted that, how did he respond to the news that he lost? Well, he could have done what any normal president would do, which is you tamp down your own disappointment and maybe even anger about it, and you do the so-called right thing, and you say, Joe Biden, we fought a good fight against Joe, but in the end, he came out ahead. We'll do everything we can to help with the transition. So, of course, he didn't do that. He also could have been a little nasty. He could have said, I think Joe Biden, this is a big mistake you all made with this, but I guess we don't have any choice but to go along with this, and I'll help out where I can. Or he could have been even nastier, and he could have said, this is a terrible mistake. A Biden administration is going to be a disaster. Thank goodness we helped to hold on to the Senate and narrowed the gap in the House, and I'm going to run again in 4 years when all you people are clamoring for me to come back and save you from this disaster. Now, that would have been a very nasty thing to say, but even that would not have done what he's doing now, which is to deny the reality that he did in fact lose. And that is far more corrosive. And I think some others on the podcast would agree, extremely dangerous. We really don't know how it's going to work out. I don't think he's literally going to go through with a coup, but he seems to be priming a sector of the American electorate to cheer one on were it to happen. And that is very, very bad.
So, Bill Galston, Adlai Stevenson famously said when he was forced to concede that he felt like the little boy who had stubbed his toe in the dark, that he was too big to cry, but it hurt too much to laugh. But my favorite loser story actually comes from a fellow named Dick Tuck, who ran for the state senate in California in 1966. He was defeated, and in his concession speech, he said, "Well, the people have spoken, the bastards." But we haven't gotten that, of course, nothing like that clever from the president. I guess the thing that I have been watching very carefully this week is how is the Republican Party handling this? And for a while there, we just had the sense of, boy, they were in lockstep. They weren't acknowledging reality. The two most prominent Republicans in the country, McConnell and McCarthy, refused to refer to Biden as the president-elect. But the ice is breaking, right? Don't you get that sense? I mean, there are quite a few now who have come out and said, first of all, he should be getting these intelligence briefings, and he should be recognized. I could name them, but do you feel like it's beginning to unravel for Trump, and that even the Republicans are coming around?
Well, I hope you're right, Mona. I can't say that I've been overly impressed with the performance of elected Republican officials nationally as yet. I welcome every addition to the side of truth and stability, but I think on balance it has been a disappointing performance. And on the other hand, it is not an inexplicable performance. Donald Trump suffered a personal defeat, but Trumpism is alive and well, clearly the dominant force within the Republican Party. I think people who are hoping for a repudiation of Trumpism to create space for the revitalization of the Republican Party must be bitterly disappointed. Perhaps some of them are even on this podcast, because I don't see the results of the election as having contributed to that restoration and reconstruction in any way. And I can't say that potential candidates like, say, Larry Hogan, who probably would like to do that, are in a very strong position right now. And so for the time being, Republican office holders, actual and aspiring, are beholden to a political party which at the grassroots level will not permit substantial deviation from a pro-Trump posture. I hope somebody can cheer me up by telling me that I'm wrong and they're big counterexamples, but I sure haven't seen them so far.
Okay, Linda, I don't suppose you're going to want to disabuse Bill of that, but what do you say about the state of the Republican Party? I mean, I'll give you a few names of people who have congratulated the winner: the governors Hogan, Phil Scott, Charlie Baker, Mike DeWine, the new governor-elect of Utah, whose name escapes me right now, Senators Lankford, Rubio, Rounds, Romney, Toomey. And also, just in the last few minutes, Lindsey Graham and Chuck Grassley have said that that Biden should begin getting intelligence briefings.
Well, let me tell you what my greater fear is. I'm not only going to not disabuse Bill of his worries, I may actually raise his anxiety levels, because what I see happening here is I know.
Steady there, Bill.
The Trumpists have essentially become what many of us back in the 70s and 80s thought of the Democratic Party, which was that there were many in the party who were really anti-American. The argument that they are making, that there was widespread abuse, that we cannot count on the fairness of our election system, that essentially the United States of America has an electoral system where ballot boxes can be stuffed, where individuals can come in and throw away ballots, where the outcome is simply not something we can count on. This is the kind of thing you say when you're talking about a banana republic. This is the American criticism of elections in authoritarian countries where they have, ostensibly an election, but it doesn't mean anything. And this line is being fed to 70 million people who voted for Donald Trump. This is, to me, profoundly un-American. This is an assault on America. Forget about the partisan divisions. This is all about democracy and who we are as a nation. And do we live in a country that is in fact free, that is in fact democratic, and in which elections are open and fair, and we can count on the results? So I am actually profoundly upset at the Republican Party's essentially acquiescence in this Trump mania and this Trump disinformation campaign that the election was somehow stolen. I think this bodes very, very ill for the future, not just of the Republican Party, but for the future of democracy in America. If you have, half of the electorate not believing that elections in the United States are free and fair, that's a real problem.
Eric, some people have said, actually, I might have been one of them, that Trump's worst qualities were that he was systematically undermining faith in American institutions. And this one, his parting shot may, in fact, be his worst. That by undermining faith in the election and the election process and inclining so many millions of Americans to think that the system is rigged, he is really going to the very heart of our system. If there isn't that basic trust, it's hard. It's really scary to contemplate the future. How do you think this is? Like if you were still in the State Department and you heard that there was a country, that had just held an election and that the existing president was refusing to acknowledge his loss and that he was, firing top officials in the security apparatus and so forth, and that major parts of his party were also, refusing to acknowledge the winner. What would you think about that country?
Well, Mona, first, thank you very much for having me. And it's great to be with this group, all of whom I admire enormously. And needless to say, I agree with pretty much everything that everybody said. And to your question, I would probably be preparing a telegram back to Washington saying that, we need to be prepared to invoke those parts of U.S. law that cut off assistance to countries that have extra constitutional changes of government. We're not quite there yet, obviously,
Right.
But this is very worrisome for all the reasons that Bill and Linda and Damon have talked about. My colleague at Johns Hopkins SAIS, Elliot Cohen, always says the problem, with politicians is not that they say things they don't believe; it's that they end up believing the things they say. And I agree with what John Bolton said in the Washington Post, that the longer this goes on, the more the presidential temper tantrum is coddled by Republicans, the worse this gets, not the better it gets. And there is a danger that people will talk themselves into believing this nonsense, as Linda suggested, that there's been some kind of widespread fraud. This is not a close election. When the votes are all counted, I think there are about 1 million outstanding in each of New York and New Jersey, California. Both of those are likely, or most of those are likely to go to Joe Biden. So when all is said and done, he's likely to end up winning the popular vote by 7 million votes. He will have won the Electoral College by the exact same margin that Trump declared was a landslide 4 years ago. He will have won in the Rust Belt states that he flipped back to the Democrats by 3 times the margin that Trump had in those same states. So this is really not a close election. His margin's likely to be larger than the one that that Barack Obama had against Mitt Romney, in whose presidential campaign I worked. So this is not a close election. People should not pretend that it's a close election. The fact that the last Republican presidential nominee, Mitt Romney, has welcomed Biden is a good thing. The last Republican president, George W. Bush, has congratulated and welcomed Biden. That's a good thing. I share Bill and Linda's concerns, but I hope, Mona, that you are right, that the tide is beginning to turn. There are more people coming out. And I noticed that even, the Wall Street Journal, which has been very indulgent on the editorial page of Trump, has basically said, it's over. And Rich Lowry of the National Review, also been willing to extend a huge benefit of the doubt to Trump, has in Politico today said it's over. So I hope this, fever begins to break and people move away from this. Because as Linda suggested, this is really very dangerous and corrosive to the fundamental norm of democracy, that losers accept that they've lost and become the loyal opposition.
Yeah. It's as we keep saying, it's one thing for Trump to have his petty concerns. And of course, it's obvious that he puts his own personal emotional needs ahead of the interests of the nation always. But the fact that he has this cult that, as you say, coddle him is the real problem. I'll just add a few more names, though, to the list of those who are bailing. Rupert Murdoch and the properties that he owns, except for the entertainment wing of Fox News, and admittedly, those are the biggest audiences. Sheldon Adelson's paper in Las Vegas, the Las Vegas Review-Journal, has written a very tart editorial telling Trump to step down and do so. I mean, to be polite about it. And Eric Erickson, an influential radio host, there's quite a long list. So there's that. Now let's talk for a minute, if we can, about the actual chances of success of these claims of voter fraud. They have waved around pieces of paper saying that they have 248 affidavits, and it turns out it's only a little over 100. In these cases, some of these are just so preposterous. Things like claims that a poll worker was wearing a Black Lives Matter T-shirt. That voters exceeded that the number of votes exceeded the registered voters in the state, in states like Wisconsin that have same-day voter registration. That absentee ballots came from out of state, which is kind of normal. That's where absentee ballots usually are from, from people who are absent from the state, and so forth. Also, let's talk a little bit about the numbers. So Fair Vote looked at recounts over the last 20 years, and they found that the average shift in votes has been about 430 when recounts are done. And the largest shift ever was a little less than 2,600 votes. Now, Biden, as of Wednesday, was leading in Wisconsin by 20,540 votes, in Pennsylvania by almost 50,000 votes, in Michigan by 146,000 and some, Arizona by about 10,000, Nevada by 36, and so on, Georgia by 14. So these are not, as Eric was saying, these are not close. There is absolutely no chance, there's vanishingly small chance that any amount of recounting would change the outcome. And these claims of fraud are utterly, utterly frivolous and absurd. Okay, let us move on to the international risks that we're under. Eric, I'd like to come back to you on this because we are seeing a situation in which the president, we don't know why he's doing this. I mean, it could be that he fired the defense secretary right after the election for the same reason that he fired Attorney General Sessions right after the 2018 elections. That is, he was holding off until after the election, even though he was stewing about this person's disloyalty as he sees it. And there's nothing more to it than that. But you, I think, know a lot of people on the inside and have some insight into this that others may not. So can you give us the benefit of your knowledge on what to make of this?
Well, the president's burning down the Department of Defense in the midst of a presidential transition, which, in my experience and to my knowledge, is unprecedented in American history, or certainly since the National Security Act of 1947 created the Department of Defense. I've been talking to some of the recently former senior officials who have exited the department over the last couple of days. And I think there are really three pieces to this, Mona. There's one piece, which is just a vengeance piece, which you adverted to in your comments, which is that Secretary Esper was resisting the president and particularly the presidential personnel office over the last several months, but he also was resisting on a number of policy matters. And so this was the president acting, vindictively and in the petty way that, seems to appeal to him, and particularly the desire to humiliate people, firing them by tweet. I think Secretary Esper maybe had about a 5-minute heads up from Mark Meadows before the tweet went out. The second piece is...
Oh, so he was treated comparatively well compared to other Trump people Trump has fired.
I suppose you could say that. I can't possibly comment, but the second piece is Afghanistan. Secretary Esper, I think, had sent a pretty strong classified memo over to the White House, outlining the concerns that the Department of Defense had about a precipitate withdrawal from Afghanistan, including notably the fact that the Taliban has not met the conditions that had been agreed, by interagency by the government, needed to be met before a withdrawal could take place. And I think there's also a third element, which is they are trying to stock the Department of Defense with Trump loyalists for this, in my view, a totally imaginary, illusory second Trump term that, Secretary Pompeo talked about the other day. So I think it's really got, three pieces to it. I think some of the darker conspiratorial views that this is precedent to an attack on Iran or something else, I don't think are true. But frankly, those three things are concerning enough.
I have to say, Bill Galston, that when I saw Secretary of State Pompeo do his little joke about, because he was asked, by the way, by a Fox News correspondent, when will the State Department acknowledge the election of Joe Biden, and how much do you worry that the delay in acknowledging his election may impact national security? And he gave a little smile and said, "We are, all prepared for, for a smooth transition to a second Trump administration." And he smiled. But I have to say, is that something to joke about? I mean, especially considering that the position that the president is taking. If it was meant as a joke, it was the least funny joke ever. And I'm not even entirely sure he meant it as a joke. What do you think?
Well, I've run out of verbs, adjectives, and nouns to characterize the statements and actions of people like Secretary Pompeo. It's disgraceful, but it's an utterly predictable disgrace. Pompeo's political future, and I think he thinks he has one, is entirely tied to President Trump. Mr. Pompeo had an opportunity to create his own political base by running for a Senate seat that he certainly would have won. And if he'd accepted if he'd accepted the invitation, indeed, the
Importunings by
importunings
McConnell.
by McConnell, and he elected to maintain his position of total political dependence on the president, and he doesn't believe that he has the ability, consistent with his future ambitions, to break from with the president on any matter, large or even small. And so he's made his bed, and now he's lying in it in both senses of the term. And I don't know. I don't know what else to say. There is this old legal phrase that I think I've cited before. Res ipsa loquitur. The thing speaks for itself, and I just hope the American people can see it for what it is.
Linda, in 2000, we had a delayed transition, a really truncated transition because of the dispute over the election. And the 9/11 Commission later wrote that they felt that the 37-day delay caused a 6-month delay in staffing up the administration because of the problem about getting security clearances and whatnot and appointees, and that this might have affected our capacity as a nation to anticipate or be aware of the 9/11 attacks. So this attack on the Defense Department at a time like this does seem to really court disaster, potentially.
Absolutely. And by the way, I can speak with some personal experience, having been nominated to a cabinet post. It was a very truncated process. The whole nomination and vetting process was truncated during the first Bush term. And I think it did do harm to the administration. But, it's very clear that this kind of vindictiveness means that many in the Republican Party, and certainly Trump himself, have no regard for the country. I mean, this idea that somehow Donald Trump loves America and is a patriot, I think is all belied by this, because what is really remarkable about democracies, and ours being the oldest and the smoothest running in the history of the world, is that there is this peaceful transfer of power. That the transfer takes place, you allow the winner to come in to clean house in terms of the political appointees, but also to be secure in knowing that the civil servants who are there, they also transition in terms of who their new bosses are. Well, it looks like one of the things that Trump is planning on doing, and they are doing it in various agencies, is to try to embed some of the political appointees into staff positions that are career positions. And it's like a fifth column that they're trying to put in place to try to not save people's jobs, not giving them job security, but really to essentially be guerrillas in the coming 4-year war that they're going to wage against the Trump administration. It is just deeply disgraceful, deeply troubling, and says that something very fundamental has happened in the United States over the last decade or so. And it's not something that is going to easily, be wiped away.
Right. And Damon, it sure gives us a taste of what a second Trump term would have begun to look like, God forbid. But let me just note about Esper that though he got the nickname Yesper because he was supposedly a yes man, he's pushing back on that quite vigorously. He gave an interview to Military Times where he had some interesting things to say. And turns out that one of the things that alienated Trump, be prepared to be unshocked, is that he resisted the Trump administration's attempt to be vindictive toward Alexander Vindman, who was up for a promotion in the normal course of events, and the Trump administration wanted to block it. And he pushed back on that. And he also he banned Confederate flags from military facilities, and he opposed the invocation of the Insurrection Act. For those things, the president wanted to punish him, and it does remind you that it reminds me anyway about Jeff Sessions, who I mentioned a few minutes ago. But I'm no fan of Sessions, of course. He was the first Republican senator to endorse Trump, and for that he will go down in history with shame. But at least when he was Attorney General, he did do the ethical thing as he saw it, and he was right to recuse himself from the investigation into the Russia business. And for doing the ethical thing, he earned the unending enmity of the commander-in-chief.
Indeed. Was there a question in there?
Oh, well,
I'm sorry.
Say whatever you want.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think it's yet another example of, among infinite others, of Trump.
Yeah.
Trump doing it's a matter of him viewing the country, its institutions, its military. Everything is supposed to be vindicated or justified in terms of its advancement of his own personal agenda and interests as he understands them. So, he would have loved Esper if Esper had done everything he told him to, and if he had gone along with the Insurrection Act during the protests over the summer, and if he had agreed to withdraw troops from Afghanistan on exactly the timetable Trump wants, and so forth. But he didn't, and it has nothing to do with really the substance of those disagreements. It's not like Trump has some lock solid expert assessment of the troop situation and the Taliban in Afghanistan, and sees that Esper is being adamantly opposed to following it, and it's a substantive policy dispute, and so he's asking for his resignation. No, it's because Trump wants to do something, and Esper is saying, well, actually, this isn't probably the best thing to do, and Trump just wants to get rid of him. And that's just the way it goes at every level, on every issue, with every person in the administration. And it's never going to end. And as you said at the top there, if there were a second Trump administration, it would be even more of that. And so we should be very grateful that the election turned out the way it did, at least in the world of reality.
Absolutely. You're right. Not in the fantasy world. Eric, I see your hand is raised, and I will come to you. I do, though, have a question for you. So make your comment first, and then I have something I wanted to ask you.
Well, I just wanted to make the point that when we talk about the dangers of the transition, and Linda's talked about this, you've talked about it. There are a couple of different parts to this. One is the part that both you and Linda talked about, which was cited in the 9/11 Commission, and that is that one of my foreign service mentors once told me, transition time is worth 3 times governing time. And the reason for that is during the transition, you have the relative luxury of being able to consider different issues without actually having to having the responsibility to make the myriad decisions that are called upon in government every day. And you're not drinking from the fire hose yet. You reflect a little bit. You can think about how you want to approach problems, and you can plan. President Eisenhower famously said that planning is everything, but no plan survives first contact with the enemy. So the plan's going to have to be adjusted, but it's much better for administrations to enter with a plan than not to be able to do that. So not allowing the Biden people to get the classified briefings that they need, and to begin to assess the state of the agencies as they are, and what might need to be done to bring them up to snuff is very bad in terms of good governance. But secondly, transition, because our system is not a parliamentary system like the UK, where you have the election and the former prime minister leaves 10 Downing Street, is replaced by the new prime minister, who walks in, and the permanent cabinet undersecretary shoves a red box at the new prime minister he or she, and says, Prime Minister, here are all the decisions you have to make tonight, and here are all the people that go behind them. Ours is a much longer, more complex process of taking over a very large government institution. And the United States is uniquely vulnerable because we only have one government at a time to adversaries pushing the envelope, seeking advantage over the United States in this period of uncertainty about exactly where U.S. policy is headed. And we've seen it happen in the past. I mean, we had a crackdown on solidarity in December of 1980 after Ronald Reagan was elected, just as he was about to come into office. There are other examples. And so to decapitate the Department of Defense and burn it down, and to at least keep in prospect the decapitation of the Central Intelligence Agency and the FBI at this moment of vulnerability is just beyond irresponsible. It's dangerous and unpatriotic, to use Linda's phrase. And the third piece of it is it enormously diminishes. You asked me about how I would see this as a diplomat looking at another country overseas. One of the great roles we play in the world is to be able to criticize Alexander Lukashenko for not holding a free and fair election in Belarus. And we do it all over the world in other places. This has been the greatest gift to Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin, and Ayatollah Khamenei that I can imagine. Khamenei was just making jokes about how the election shows that American democracy is flawed, and who are they to tell anybody else about how to run a democracy. So this is on multiple levels. This holdup of the transition is bad governance and dangerous to the country.
Thank you for that. I do have one other question on this, on a related subject. There are a lot of people, sort of in my circle, I would say, who voted for Biden because Trump was unacceptable and unfit, but who are a little worried about Biden's approach to foreign policy, who worry, for example, that when he is seeking to undo things Trump did, one of them might be the withdrawal from the JCPOA, the Iran deal. So I know you personally opposed the Iran deal at the time. And what's your sense about, if you have one, about where a Biden administration might go on that topic?
My former boss, Bob Gates, Secretary of Defense, in his memoir "Duty," basically said that he thought Joe Biden had been wrong about every major national security issue that he could remember.
Right.
And I have a somewhat similar view. Although Secretary Gates, when he was quoted on that by the Wall Street Journal, was at great pains to also say that he thought Biden was a person of great character and a very decent human being, and I agree with that as well.
And he added that Trump was unfit. And
Trump is unfit. And so I'm quite happy to be part of a group of Republicans, former Republican national security officials who endorsed Biden, and a group of 800 bipartisan national security officials who endorsed Biden, et cetera. And I have a lot of confidence, by the way, in most of the people around him. I think he's surrounded by a very professional team of people, both who are likely to be in the National Security Council, state and defense. I might not always agree with them, and I might have tactical differences, but I think they're all extremely smart. They're all patriots and committed to the nation. On the JCPOA per se, Mona, I think, I went through 5 presidential transitions. I went through my first one was the Carter-Reagan transition, and I went through the Reagan-Bush transition, which up until this one was maybe the most contentious, actually.
Wow.
And then the Bush-Clinton, Clinton-Bush, and Bush-Obama transitions. And one thing I've noticed is that, every new team comes in, and because they're people who've been in government before, usually the Trump administration being something of an exception, it takes them a little bit of time to understand and learn that in the 4 or 8 years that they've been out of office, or 12 years, that things have changed, that the world has moved on, and that they can't just go back to the positions that they were in, at the last time they were in government. And I think that that's going to be the case with the Biden administration and the JCPOA agreement with Iran. And that is because, first of all, the Trump administration, to its credit, I think, has built up an enormous amount of leverage through the maximum pressure campaign on Iran and the sanctions. Moreover, Iran is now very seriously out of compliance with its undertakings under the agreement, even though the Europeans stayed in it after President Trump pulled us out. And I think the latest IAEA report, I think I was just reading this morning, shows that they've got 10 or 12 times the low enriched uranium that they're entitled to hold under the agreement, and at higher levels of enrichment than they're allowed under the agreement. Those are facts that the Biden people are going to have to address. And there's even some tension in the Democratic platform between immediately going back into the JCPOA, but also recognition that some of the things that have happened since the Obama administration left office have highlighted some of the defects in the agreement that I and others were concerned about at the time the agreement was reached, like the expiration in October of the conventional arms embargo on Iran. So my suspicion is that knowing this and recognizing that time has moved on, that they've got both some leverage that they should not squander because they will be criticized if they do, and because there will be congressional concern. I don't think they want to pick a fight with Mitch McConnell and the Republicans on this right at the outset of the administration. And we should remember that it would not just be Senate Republicans who would be troubled by this. Chuck Schumer came out against the JCPOA in the summer of 2015, as did Bob Menendez, the ranking Democrat on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and Senator Ben Cardin, who is the next ranking Democrat after Menendez. So there will be some congressional opposition to a simple walk back into the JCPOA, which I think is really not practical in any event. So I suspect there'll be some time. I think they will try to engage the Iranians. I think they will try to figure out if there's a path towards a longer, more comprehensive agreement that restrains Iran, its nuclear ambitions more completely than the JCPOA did over a longer period of time, hopefully without any time limit. And also deals with some of the other issues that were left out of the agreement, like the ballistic missile inventory that Iran maintains, as well as its malign behavior throughout the region. So I don't expect them to actually take that one on early and walk back into it. I could be wrong, but that's the way I see it.
Excellent. Okay, topic 3. You could make a case that the outcome of the 2020 election was a ringing endorsement of centrism. You could really say that the country showed they're all big Beg to Differ fans, that they're right in the center. Bill Galston, you wrote a column sort of making that point this week, without the reference to Beg to Differ, but... Bill, are you with us?
I'm with you. Your voice got cut off for a second.
Sorry. I was just saying that that you wrote a column this week arguing that the election results, when you look at them top to bottom, were kind of an endorsement of centrism, and I decided to add to that this means the country really is a whole bunch of Beg to Differ type people, right in the center.
Well, I think I'll make 2 points in response. When you add the decisions of the American people at the national level, add them all up, and what you have now is a situation that that cries out for a greater measure of bipartisan cooperation than we've seen in quite some time. Or to put it as bluntly as possible, unless there is more, we will experience a very frustrating period of gridlock at a time when there are genuine national emergencies and urgencies to deal with. And I'm an optimist that in the face of this reality, which I think most Americans acknowledge, that Senator McConnell will not choose to begin with the objective of ensuring that Joe Biden will be a one-term president, as he famously declared for Barack Obama in 2009. To say nothing of the fact that Joe Biden will probably be a one-term president anyway. So the problem is moot. And we'll see whether Biden will begin his administration with the sorts of proposals that in principle could generate a productive bipartisan conversation. Everybody knows what they are and what they aren't. So that's point number one. Without beg to differ politics, we'll get gridlock. Point number two, if you look at the expressions of popular will at the state level, they do point, I believe, in a center-seeking direction. I pitched my article, framed it as a tale of two states, Florida and California. Florida gave Trump a larger margin of victory than has been the case for a number of previous presidential cycles. At the same time, the same Florida electorate, by a vote of 61 to 39%, authorized a staged increase in the minimum wage of $15 an hour, almost double what it is in Florida now. So, is Florida sending conservative signals, liberal signals, or some of one and some of the other? I think the outcome speaks for itself. California, Joe Biden got 2/3 of Californians' votes. At the same time, out of the enormous number of ballot measures, initiatives on the ballot, most of the high-profile progressive initiatives went down to crashing defeat, and in many cases, it wasn't even close. So is California sending liberal signals or moderate signals, or some combination of the two? Again, I think the third box is the one to check. And if you look around the country at other states, you see very similar patterns. They are willing to liberalize the treatment of drugs, for example, both within the criminal justice system and elsewhere. At the same time, a number of conservative-appearing initiatives enjoyed success. So, yeah, I think the American people are calling for an end to single-party governance. Whether their call will be heeded is a different question altogether, because there isn't an altogether tight combination between the people and their elected representatives.
Damon, you often hear it said that American politics has become just entertainment and identity expression and tribalism, that it isn't even about the discussion of issues and so forth. But in light of what Bill points out, and I can add to it, it's really interesting that California voters, very liberal blue state, but they said no to expanding rent control. They said no to reinstating affirmative action, as Linda pointed out last week. They said they want to undo Assembly Bill 5 that would put a lot of independent contractors out of work, including Lyft and Uber drivers and so forth, and many others. And so it seems as if, despite the toxicity of so much of what we see coming out of the Trump administration and out of national politics, that at some levels anyway, we're still governing, we're still choosing. It isn't all just performative.
Well, in general, I think the more local you go with politics, it sometimes gets a little more concrete and focused on actual issues. It's at the national level that things become this kind of strange hall of mirrors where we're, all fighting about abstractions, and it's a lot of negative partisanship. I think it's a very complicated story, and we don't even have the full election counts or the properly reweighted exit polls to look at yet. But I liked Bill's column, and I think there's a lot of truth there about the need for and craving for something in the middle. My own view on that I've been developing in columns over the last few years is that it's a little bit different center than a lot of people in Washington and people who watch Washington assume it to be. I think it tends to be on some economic issues fairly far to the left, not as far as Bernie Sanders, but definitely a kind of FDR direction in terms of economics. And then I think pretty conservative on social issues, which is not exactly where the center is usually presumed to be. The center tends to be, we tend to assume the center is like economic libertarianism and then left-wing libertarianism, like on cultural and social issues, whereas I think it's in a way almost the reverse. But I would also point out that the case sort of for thinking that politics remains very polarized and nasty and such, I think to some extent was, I think, borne out by the results of the election. I mean, simply look at the turnout. Why is it that turnout was up so much, not just on the Democratic side in order to get Trump out, but then matched by a not as large but still very significant red wave to keep, whatever, like the woke brigades and anti-police and socialist throngs on the left from taking over. So each side motivated, I think, its voters primarily by hatred of an imagined other. And if you think about it, I mean, Biden said remarkably little in the campaign about what he was running to do, and a lot about how he was running against Trumpism. And Trump said almost nothing about what he was running to do, unlike 4 years ago when he did sort of have a positive message of some kind. Now it was all about not being them, not being, the Hunter Biden presidency combined again with kind of defund the police and socialism's on the march and all of that. So,
and Biden was against God. Don't forget that.
Oh, yes, of course. And if you elect him, then God is out of a job or something.
Yes. Bill, did you want to respond to Damon real quick?
Yeah, I think his point about the center not being exactly what it used to be is very well taken. I will note that his formulation of the new center as liberal on economics and conservative on culture is a pretty good rough and ready working definition of populism.
Exactly. Yes. I would say it's a kind of centrist populism. Yeah.
Right. And now I would just offer one quick qualification, and that is culturally conservative on some issues, but not all issues. There's been an enormous movement across party lines on drugs and drug legalization, for example. That used to be a defining cultural divide going back to the late 60s and early 70s. It clearly isn't anymore. And relatedly, there's been a change in the location of the center with regard to criminal justice reform. And nobody, or hardly anybody, is in favor of, quote unquote, defunding the police. But if you look at the bill, for example, that Tim Scott crafted in the Senate and the kinds of interesting responses that it has evoked in the House, I think you can see the center on criminal justice reform is very different from where it was in the late 80s and early 90s. So like the Rio Grande, as the river meanders, the center of the river changes its location.
Yeah, speaking just for myself, I have to say that I've changed on the drug war over the years. I will note that my mentor and first boss, William F. Buckley Jr., was way ahead of the curve on this. He was against the drug war, I think, back in the 70s. But in any event, I've come around to thinking that though I don't want to encourage more drug use by legalizing drugs, I think the price that we're paying for keeping them so restricted and illegal is just too high in lives lost and neighborhoods destroyed, and therefore I've changed. So I don't know, I'm maybe a feather, maybe a straw in the wind. But Linda, let me ask you about one thing that maybe people will learn from this election, maybe not. But do you think some people will sort of take the message that Black and Hispanic voters should not be treated as monoliths? I mean, there were a surprising number of Black and Hispanic males, especially, who voted for Trump. And while I can't say I agree with their choice, I'm hoping that people will recognize on both sides that these voters they're not blocks, that they're individuals and they should be appealed to as such. And Republicans shouldn't be afraid of Hispanic voters, and Democrats shouldn't take them for granted.
Well, I think with respect to African Americans, they are still mostly a bloc. He got about 15% of the Black vote, but that's still,
of the male Black vote,
right?
He
Yeah,
got less than that among Black women,
right? Yeah. So it's but Hispanics, I've been singing this tune for a very long time. I wrote a book about it over 30 years ago about Hispanics. Hispanics are very much more like previous immigrant groups in the United States. They're probably more like Italians than they are any other group. And if you know your history, Italians gravitated towards the Republican Party in the middle of the last century and have pretty much stayed there. Hispanics have been voting for Republican for president for a very long time. I think I've said it on this show before. About a third of Mexican Americans voted for Richard Nixon in 1972. Somewhere between 40 and 44% voted for both Ronald Reagan and George W. Bush in their reelection bids. And so you really do have diversity in the Hispanic community. And I think one of the things Americans don't understand about Hispanics is there is much less of the kind of grievance victim politics in the Hispanic community than there is, I think, in some parts of the African-American community. Hispanics, by and large, and particularly immigrants, don't think of themselves as victims. They see themselves as being given a chance to succeed. The Pew Research Group has done lots of polling. One of the most fascinating polls asked people, what it took to get ahead in the United States. Hispanics were actually slightly more likely than whites to believe that hard work is what was most responsible for whether or not you succeeded or failed in America. So I do think that this is going to make people look more closely at Hispanics. I was frankly surprised that Mexican Americans in South Texas were not more turned off by Trump's really vicious language about Mexicans.
Me too. Yeah.
But I think what they looked at is, gee, I'm a small business person. I've got, a restaurant. I've got a landscaping company. I've got, a small business that did very well in the first 3 years of the Trump administration. The pandemic has, made that problematic for me, and I want to get back to work. And they sort of thought maybe they would have a better chance of the economy coming back under Trump than they would under Biden. Whether that's accurate or not is not for me to say, but I think that was what was driving it. And they weren't thinking first and foremost of themselves as Mexican or Mexican American. They were thinking of themselves in terms of the communities in which they lived, the way they made their livelihood, and the kind of public policy choices that made sense for them. So I do think that's encouraging. I think it is an example of why Hispanics are, in fact, much to the, I think surprise of many conservatives, are in fact assimilating to the American mainstream.
I'll just add this quote from Josh Kraushar, who's been a guest on this show, and he's with the National Journal. He said, every single seat Republicans flipped in the House was won by a woman, a minority, or a veteran. Just kind of an interesting little datum. Eric, I know you're an expert on foreign policy, but I'm just curious whether the last 4 years, the experience of watching what has become of the Republican Party has changed your views about domestic issues at all.
It has, Mona. I think The killing of George Floyd, and not just the killing of George Floyd, but the pattern of young unarmed black men being killed by police officers has made me realize, as well as the sort of vein of racism that Donald Trump has exploited, since before he started running for president, that with the birther conspiracy, has just made me realize that there is a lot more work we need to do as Americans, on dealing with questions of racial equality and justice than I had thought, previously. And I also think I think one of the great issues that two other issues I've changed my view on a bit. One is income inequality. Having been ambassador to a country, Finland, which has one of the most equal distributions of wealth in the world, and then to see the growing inequality in the United States, I do think that's something conservatives really have to start figuring out an answer to. And just purely saying, well, let the market sort it all out, I don't think is sufficient for the conservative movement in the United States to take that position. And the final one is industrial policy. And here I have maybe some hope that a Biden administration can find some common ground with Republicans, and we may be able to do it. We may finally get infrastructure week, because I think the strategic competition we find ourselves in with China requires an approach that's different from the kind we had with the strategic competition with the Soviet Union, which was not a market economy. China is, and China's civil military fusion that they have created, and the amount of investment that they're putting into new technologies that are going to change the future of the battlefield in military terms in the future, probably requires some element of industrial policy in the United States. I don't think it's enough to say the market should allocate capital in all of these areas. There's some areas where I think we're going to need the government to become more involved. And I think there's an openness in some parts of the Republican Party to that as well now. And a potential for, I think, a compromise. Bill would know better than I, but I think that's a possibility.
Interesting. All right. We've now come to the section of our podcast where we do a highlight or low light of the week, something we'd like to take note of. So, Damon, let's start with you.
Well, I always feel a little guilty when I do this, and I'm sure Mona will tell me off air that I should never do it again if it's not a good thing. But I occasionally will plug something from my own website, my employer, The Week. This time, there's a really interesting piece up just today on Thursday by a guy named David Ferris, who is several steps to my left. He's been one of the leading champions of saying the Democrats need to pack the cord and break up California into 3 states and do all these fairly radical kind of structural changes in order to counteract the counter-majoritarianism of the Republican Party. And on all that, I disagree with him quite a lot. But he has a really great piece up today titled, "Was Trump Ever as Unpopular as We Thought?" where this guy who's firmly on the left looks at the really, in some cases, astonishing polling errors and just asks, what if Trump was always about 5 points more popular than we thought? And reflects on the fact that, despite the fact that Biden, yes, he won decisively and at the national level by about, probably will end up being about 7 million or so votes. In the Electoral College, if there were a 1-point swing further toward Trump, he would have won. And that makes you wonder things like, well, gee, like if Trump had been 30% less of a jerk in that first debate, could he have actually prevailed? So Ferris, as someone on the left, really is honest enough to look at some of the data and to think about what this might mean for Democrats, for the left, and for the country. And it's a good read and thoughtful.
Interesting. Linda. Well, give Linda a chance to think about it. Bill.
Well, I have two items to put on the table, a highlight and a warning. For me, the high point, perhaps, of this entire misbegotten year has been Joe Biden's dignified, pitch perfect performance since the polls closed 9 days ago. I have to say, he has exceeded my expectations for self restraint, for magnanimity, for generosity. I just think he's been magnificent, and he's also given Democrats and his supporters a lesson in the kind of patience that you can only develop with maturity. And I think he has already made a contribution to the country.
Amen to that. I agree.
Now, my warning, and this may seem very obscure, but I think it has profound implications. For those who've been following the just ended conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan over Nagorno-Karabakh, the fact that the Armenian forces were decimated by missile-armed drones suggests to me that there has been a fundamental shift in the nature of land warfare, and that nations that enter into ground campaigns without full dominance of the skies are going to get their heads handed to them. And the more weapons that countries can purchase by the main producers of these weapons, including Israel and Turkey, the more in danger land forces will be. This is a potential revolution in the military balance of power, and I hope that people in the Defense Department have gone to school on what just happened. I'm confident that they will, but I hope they get it right the first time.
Okay, Linda.
Yes, I want to point out something from the Claremont Institute, which is a somewhat minor think tank out on the West Coast. Mona, you and I know it well, maybe others don't. I might say at the beginning that the mission of the Claremont Institute is, quote, to restore the principles of the American founding to their rightful preeminent authority in our national life. Well, this is what the Claremont Institute had to say about the election this week. In an article written under the pseudonym Horatius, they wrote, "Kamikaze Trump. If Trump is going down, he should take the swamp monsters down with him." And they have a variety of actions that they are proposing. One is to end the wars. They want an immediate withdrawal, I guess, from Afghanistan. They want him in the last days of his presidency to fire the generals. They want him to appoint a special counsel to investigate Biden corruption. They want every Republican judge near retirement to retire and Mitch McConnell to busily confirm Republican judicial nominees. They want to declassify virtually everything, I guess. Maybe they should just join up with WikiLeaks on that. They want to finalize rules. They want to take executive orders and turn them into actual regulations. And they want to burrow the political appointees, as I referred to earlier, into the bowels of the civil service. This really does sound like restoring the principles of the American founding. It shows the depths, the degradation that some on the right have fallen into in the last 3.5 years.
Moral depravity comes to mind. By the way, this was the same Claremont Institute that made Jack Posobiec, the spreader of the Pizzagate conspiracy theory on Twitter. They made him a fellow, a
Right.
Lincoln fellow. Yeah.
Don't forget the Flight 93 election.
Yes, which was in a Claremont publication.
Right.
Okay, Eric, final thoughts?
Well, first, I agree with Linda about the Claremontsters, and
that's good.
And I very much agree with Bill about both the tone that Vice President Biden has set, but also his comment about drone warfare in the South Caucasus. I would just note for Bill that it's not just in the South Caucasus where Turkish TB2 drones have made a huge difference on the battlefield. They also changed the balance of forces in Libya and promoted the GNA government on the battlefield there. And it's worth thinking a little bit about how this happened. I mean, the reason Turkey became a producer of drones was because we denied them armed Predators and Reapers because of the missile technology control regime, setting off, I think, potential arms race in unmanned aviation around the world because they will proliferate it hither, thither, and yon rather than letting us do it in a more controlled way. So it's one of the, I think, unanticipated consequences of arms control. I have a sort of different highlight and low light, and they're the same event. And that is that when my successor, several times removed, James Anderson, who was acting as Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, was terminated by the Trump White House. He was clapped out of the Pentagon by his colleagues. That is to say, they formed a giant cordon at the river entrance and applauded him as he departed the building, which I think shows the degree of respect that he had as someone who was trying to preserve traditional values of an apolitical civil service, protecting his colleagues, and fighting with Secretary Esper, I think, for sane policies. The consequence of which was that the White House reached out immediately to Secretary Miller and his new team of Trump lickspittles and demanded that they identify every presidential appointee who had participated in this so they could be fired.
Gosh. Wow. Just amazing. All right. Mine is a tribute to Representative James Clyburn of South Carolina, who, the great man theory of history is held in low esteem these days by historians. There's much more focus on great sweeps of movements and technological changes and other things. But individuals still matter tremendously in history. There are hinge moments. And I think as we now, with the advantage of hindsight, when we look back on the 2020 presidential race, we can see clearly that Jim Clyburn's decision to endorse Biden when he did made the crucial difference. When Clyburn endorsed him, he got the African-American community behind him in South Carolina. He went on to a resounding win. He had lost the early contests, but after that, he had momentum. And then the party lined up behind him and others dropped out in his favor and so on. And had Biden not been the nominee, I think we can also begin to see now, it is very doubtful that we would not be looking at a second Trump term. And so Clyburn has earned our eternal gratitude. And it's just a reminder that every single person, every decision that each of us makes can have far-reaching consequences that we don't always see in the moment. And every person matters, in every individual. All right. On that note, I would just like to remind our listeners that if you are listening to us on your browser, that's great, but it would be more convenient for you and frankly, a little better for us if you would subscribe to one of the podcasting apps and have us on a regular download. And we would appreciate that. Of course, ratings and reviews are always helpful, especially if they're 5 stars. If not, forget it. I want to just express our deep gratitude to Eric Edelman for sharing his wisdom with us. This was really, really interesting. And thank you, one and all. We will be back next week, as every week.